Greetings, YouTube. So I'm currently reading a book about Atlantis called Imagining Atlantis. There will be a review of it eventually. Um, and I'm almost near the end. It's quite good, but I think they could have edited it a little tighter. And having thought about it, and being me, I found myself on Google Images poking around on the top using the search parameters of Atlantean weapons. And I came to realize that there is a distinct dichotomy when it comes to Atlantean weapons. In the first category of Atlantean weapons, we have weapons that were used by Atlanteans when Atlantis is on the surface. So it's a surface nation, an island, continent, depending how big you want to make it. Um, and it's just going to have a different stylistic flavor of weapons, just like Chinese weapons have a certain look and style, Egyptian weapons, European weapons with subdivisions of all the different European nations, African weapons with variations from country to country, South American, Polynesian. You get the point. It's just going to have a feel that is an Atlantean weapon. And I believe one of the best examples that I could probably point to is probably going to be the sword that Conan uses in the Schwarzenegger version of Conan, the first film, where he finds it under the earth in a tomb, which essentially is, I think, is supposed to be an Atlantean, but it's a very important, powerful sword. Strong, not magical, but it's just very well made. So they're just going to be conventional weapons, just with a certain stylistic theme to them. And that can be anything you want to. I think the first weapon I found on that search was an Atlantean mace from a Conan game. And Conan is supposed to be set in the era just after the Ice Age and before written language really becomes prevalent. There's a little window right there where it's supposed to exist. And it's going to be right after Atlantis was lost through sunk under the ocean or consumed by a volcanic eruption or whisked away to another dimension. Again, you can do what you want to with Atlantis. Atlantis is no more real than Narnia. But the other type of Atlantean weapons are weapons that are from Atlantis that is beneath the sea and still a viable, functioning underwater society. So these are weapons that are designed to be used in water by peoples like either Submariner from Marvel or Aquaman in the DC universe, functioning aquatic environments. D&D would be the equivalent of the Sea Elves or the Sahuin or the Kowtow, different races that live underneath the ocean. And like for Cerulean Sea, for example, has just a plethora of races that live under the ocean. Definitely check out Cerulean Sea if you want underwater stuff. There is just nothing better for Pathfinder, flat out. It is the one-stop shop if you need to do anything for an aquatic campaign. That's where you go. And ideally, all of the weapons used for an aquatic Atlantean campaign, or any kind of aquatic campaign, are going to be thrusting, piercing weapons. And I discovered while I'm looking at Atlantean weapons, I'm looking at Atlanteans that are aquatic. So they have, they've got visible gills, and they usually have little ears that have little frills on them. Some of them have fins on their ankles, or their forearms, or their webbed hands and toes, and sometimes fins on their calves, and maybe even a fin on their back or something. Sometimes they even have a tail, or you could go full mer character, so they have a full fish tail. And in some of these characters, they're carrying weapons that are not thrusting. They're carrying blunt weapons or slashing weapons, which makes absolutely no sense. 0 sense. Because you can't use a non-magical thrusting, rather slashing or blunt, wacky type of weapon underwater. Now, if you've got like freedom of movement from a ring, or the item itself has that on it, and it's magic, okay, you can have anything you want to. Sky's the limit. You could be using Mjolnir down there, or two-handed great clubs. It doesn't matter. But if you're not, and you're just a normal everyday person underwater, whether you're a human using something to let you breathe underwater, or you're an aquatic race that lives down there full time, you're going to need weapons that are piercing because you just can't swing something underwater. The water resistance is vastly higher than air resistance. Someone want to figure out, tell me what the difference is? I'd love to, go ahead. I didn't look it up. There's a difference between air resistance and water resistance. I don't know what it is, but it's really high. Try it sometime if you're under the water. Um, and some of the classic weapons you'll see for underwater races are going to be like spears or tridents. Tridents are really common. That's Poseidon's main weapon, and Aquaman carries one all the time. His is magic, I believe, and it's also a symbol of office. Um, and also you're going to be using blades, and the blades are going to be daggers like dirks, long knives, or short swords like a gladius. Those are it. That's what you're going to be using. You're probably not going to be using things like a rapier because they're very flexible, and I don't think they would function as well when you're trying to pierce something that say has heavier flesh than a human. And many underwater animals and creatures you're going to encounter are going to be tougher than that. So I'm not sure if a rapier or foil is really going to what you want to go with. I think you're going to want to go with a dagger or a dirk. Even a scram sax might work. Of course, you're going to carry knives as tools, not as weapons, because knives are always useful. You can cut things without any major issue underwater, as long as you're not trying to move real fast. I'm trying to slash with them or something like that. But when you're doing thrusting with a spear or trident, you're not going to have as much strength because you're floating. Unless you're standing on something, if you thrust while floating, you just don't have that much oomph because you're not pushing against something. You're just not. It would be like trying to thrust while floating in free fall in space. You're really going to want to grab your opponent and thrust with a small blade. Combat is going to be a really close thing. You may even want to have a mechanic, whatever system you're using, where the person, to get their full strength bonus, they may have to achieve a grapple, or at least a grab. And once they have that person, then they can thrust with their full strength, because now they have the oppositional ability to really drive that blade in. But they're just thrusting like this at a target, and they're not holding on to them in some way. It's not going to be as effective or efficient. This is a big bonus for like a barbed trident, because you could get a barbed trident in there, essentially grappling with your target and then using a knife to finish them off. That would be a definite move. Or potentially you could have things like you could use combat teams with like one guy or two guys with tridents to pierce and hold the thing, and then another person moving in, grabbing one of the tridents and pulling and holding the shaft, then going in for the kill. I think I postulated a similar concept at one point for a design of a 5-pointed tiger spear, which is essentially it's a 5-bladed trident for used against zombies. So you'd have a 2-person team with these things, holding the zombie at distance, and then you have another person coming in and going for the kill shot with an axe or a machete or something. A very similar concept here. Again, that only works for combating single opponents. It's not really going to be effective in war. That war is going to be much more difficult in an underwater environment because you're dealing with 3 dimensions, and that's really important to remember. Normally when you're in combat, you're standing on the ground. You've got like 9 5-foot squares around you to worry about. When you're underwater, man, you got to worry about the ones above you and below you at the same time. It requires a much higher degree of situational awareness. Now, when it comes to missile weapons, I think if you're running like D&D or Pathfinder or other games that are a little on the squishy, abstract combat side, you could get away with like a crossbow or a version of a crossbow. Not surface crossbows, but a purpose-built underwater crossbow to stand in for a spear gun. Or you could have aquatic races have developed through alchemical science actual rubber. So they've got efficient rubber for creating spear guns. I think that's well within the realm of alchemy for either D&D or Pathfinder or most other systems that aren't really engineer geared. Maybe not something you want to use in Hero, which is very detail oriented. But I think for other games that are a little more abstract, you could just a little hand wavy think, okay, these folks have developed some really efficient rubbers from some sea polymers or extracts from X, Y, or Z underwater, alchemical process, and rubber. Um, so you could have spear guns, and that would be the best way to go. But other than that, you're not really going to have anything to use as missile weapons. Blowguns aren't going to work. Throwing things isn't going to work. Just you you could do things like dropping weapons. For example, a weighted spear that you drop downwards. But that's going to be very situational, probably going after large animals or creatures, underwater leviathans of some variety. And you're probably going to want to use poison. Poison is going to be heavily used in an aquatic environment. It's going to be thick, viscous poisons, obviously, or maybe poisons covered in a coating of some kind of equivalent to wax or something, so that they stay viable until they hit their target. But you may only get one hit in an aquatic environment because, again, you're dealing with three-dimensional combat, so you may not be able to set things up and get the kind of situation you want. Ambushes are going to be very important, trying to driving an opponent towards your compatriots, going for backstab, things like that. It's going to require probably a little more layout for combat than maybe you're used to on the surface. But the weapons themselves are going to be thrusting. So whenever you see something in a fantasy game or a picture or a comic or anime or manga or anything that shows an aquatic creature holding a big ass club on their shoulder or a two-handed sword, that's one of those anime swords with 7-foot blades that are as wide as my skull, they just won't work underwater. Or like, chain weapons. Yeah, not a whole lot of Mansuki Guris underwater. Just you don't get those things. Yeah, no meteor hammers underwater. So this has just been a little observational rant on my part. I want to get a conversation started about what types of weapons you have encountered in aquatic campaigns. What type do you put limits, or do you not care? Is your game abstract to the point where you're indifferent to the physics of the underwater world? And an attack is an attack. You could be using some really old school OSR type game where all weapons do the same damage, and they just have a certain variation based on the user's training or strength or both. You just divide it into different weapon types of damage types. Maybe you don't even do that. You've taken it to abstract, which damage is damage, and that's all there is to it. I did something very similar in a dice pool game I whipped up literally on the fly once, where damage was pretty much damage. It didn't get any more detailed than that. It was an interesting experiment, but not something I want to use full time, frankly. Not to mention I don't remember most of it because I never wrote it down. I just whipped it up in my head. So let's talk about Atlantean weapons. What do you think Atlantean weapons should look like in the above world version of Atlantis, and what do you think they should look like in the below surface environments? And have you ever used Atlantis? I know I did a video not long ago, I think, on Atlantis, and there may be more because this is a pretty good book and it got me thinking about it. So right now I'm talking about and thinking about Atlantean weapons.